Hello, everybody. So we are here from the defense of Karl Naumann-Woleske, the organization of the defense of US models. So Karl will present the work of his thesis for 45 minutes approximately, and then the members of the jury will ask questions to Karl about the PhD thesis, which we are looking forward to have their answers and insightful discussion. And then the jury will deliberate, and then we'll give the result of this deliberation. So thanks a lot to you, Karl, for the work and the member of the jury. And Karl, we are listening to you.
Right. Thank you, Antoine. All right. Well, dear members of the jury, thank you for being here today, your audience, both in person and online. So I'm going to be talking about for my students about my PhD thesis on scenario discovery in a complex economy, trying to explore the parameter space of macroeconomic models. So to ground this, the guiding question that I wish to discuss today is, what is the set of phenomena that you can generate with a macroeconomic agent-based models, and try to understand what drives these given phenomena that one can discover. And this is the result of, well, the 3 years of my PhD work, which resulted in 5 publications and preprints, which began working directly on macroeconomic models before being introduced, and this is what I will introduce to you today, the idea of sloppy models and how they work, and how we can apply this idea to macroeconomic agent-based models. You can also see that I spent a variety of time going to different conferences in Italy, which was quite good. Okay, so the thesis itself is split into 2 parts. The first part, on a more methodological side, directly tries to answer the question of exploring the parameter space, understanding the types of scenarios and what drives them. And the second part talks more about confidence and collective behavior in 3 different macroeconomic models that we developed as part of this thesis. And for today's events, I want to focus primarily on part 1. I will very briefly cover the models of part 2, but primarily wish to talk about sloppy models, what makes a model sloppy, as I will introduce to you briefly, putting this into formalisms, and then showing you how this works with an agent-based. Okay. Before we get into technical details, let's take a step backwards and consider the challenge of what we are modeling. We're trying to model the macroeconomy, which can be described to some degree as a network of millions of firms connected by physical ties, with a network of billions of households through on the order of trillions of different contracts, both physical, regarding physical products, but also financial contracts. And all of this is embedded in an institutional thing. And this is a rather complex system. So the example you can see here is a map of Hungary with each of the firm-to-firm transactions as recorded by VAT data between all of the firms just within the relatively small economy of Hungary. And as you can see, this is already by itself a very dense network with a rather complicated structure. Okay, so how do we model sort of this type of complex systems? So to understand that, let's take a quick step backwards in time to Santa Fe in 1987 and 1997, where there were 2 auspicious conferences, which brought together economists, for instance, the likes of Kenneth Arrow, who's well known in general equilibrium theory, with physicists such as Phil Anderson, who's well known for his article on More is Different. And the outcome of this, as summarized by a guy called Rotzer, is that they gave complex systems roughly 6 types of properties that you wish to capture when you're modeling. This includes dispersed interactions, so effectively you have heterogeneous agents that are acting locally with one another. So this is the absence of a global controller. So there's no unit that can globally have all information and try to reshuffle the system to make it optimal or better allocated. There's a cross-cutting hierarchical organization, whether that's within, for instance, a firm, those are hierarchies, but also across different agents. And each of these agents are continuously adapting in an environment that is also continuously changing because it is characterized by perpetual novelty. So new markets, new technologies, new niches that appear in the ecology of the system. And all of this kind of ends up with an out of equilibrium set of dynamics with, well, there may be 0 or even multiple equilibrium, but most of the dynamics themselves don't ever really converge to the point of that equilibrium. And so despite all of these interacting individual local parts, you do still retain an emergent global structure. So you can think of, for instance, business cycles at the aggregate level. So how do we try to capture all of this in models and what phenomenon we generate? So as far as economics goes, I think it is rather useful to characterize the economics profession as a diverse set of evolving ideas that are kind of brought together by their approach to modeling economic problems. Most notably, there's been one relatively central modeling approach to these models, which you could describe as sort of the dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium approach. So you have very strong believers in this approach who will tell you that any idea you have about the dynamics of an economy should be able to be captured within a DSG model. And if you can't capture it, then maybe you should try it a bit harder or try again. And so what are these? So they're dynamic in the sense that you have agents in this model, or often representative agents, that forms an expectation on the future. They are stochastic in the sense that this economic system is continuously hit by random exogenous shocks. So for instance, an energy price shock might be considered exogenous to this economy. And they are general equilibrium in the sense that we are general by trying to model the whole of the macroeconomy. And we are solving this model in an equilibrium sense. What this means is that agents effectively are solving some very complex optimization problem. And the solution of the model is sort of a self-consistent solution to all of these individual optimization problems. And so these types of models at their origin by Robert Lucas' critique of prior models that were structural econometric models, because in these models, agents could react to policy interventions, and which means that if you calibrate a model and you do a policy intervention, the model itself is no longer valid because the state of the world that you calibrated on has changed. And so you said, well, we need behavioral micro-foundations so that in order for agents to be allowed to adapt. And these micro-foundations have mostly become associated with rational expectations, in the sense that in a original business cycle models, you have an infinitely lived representative household seeking to maximize utility from consumption in nature, subject to an intertemporal budget constraint that, for instance, you're basically optimizing over an infinite time horizon, and you know the structure of the economy. These were then converted essentially into this new Keynesian dynamic general equilibrium models by adding nominal rigidities within prices of wages, as well as monopolistic competition to better match sort of the static picture of the economy. Now, this all sounds very complicated and very useful, but there's also been a lot of detractors for this approach that do not like, basically find that, in the words, you could go very far as taking Paul Roma's words and saying that for more than 3 decades, macroeconomics, by using this approach, has gone backwards. And to highlight a recent example, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the Federal Reserve's summary of economic projections, where the black solid line is the actual realization of inflation over time, and the dashed lines show basically their projections at all of these different points in times. And you can see that they all relatively quickly return to the equilibrium of the central bank's 2% inflation target, which, if you're at the beginning of this curve, is not very useful for making policy because, well, your prediction will counter to what the realization of the actual economic trend is. So you can capture this in some frequent objections, being the representative agent, trying to capture all households by one representative household. Their rationality, the fact that they are able to solve this infinite horizon problem, the absence of a financial system, weak empirical fits, the use of equilibrium. If you recall, one of the properties of the 6 properties I introduced initially was that you have a lot of out equilibrium dynamics. And so trying to study within equilibrium model might not really tell you anything about the out of equilibrium dynamics. And the ensuing contention that they potentially have very little usefulness for policy analysis. Now, of course, this is not to say that economists have not been trying to work on these models by introducing things like bounded rationality or heterogeneous agent communication model, so trying to expand from 1 to 2 representative agents to a continuum of agents, and firm networks. So you have sort of this Acemoglu picture of a static network. But nonetheless, whether that is from the equilibrium solution concept or some of the other critiques I listed, it seems unlikely that these models by themselves will be able to tell us something useful about, for instance, crisis dynamics. And so it goes that at the very least, we should be able to have different types of models because collective accuracy is basically the average accuracy. So if you have a model that may not be predicting well, but you have one that does, you already have better predictions. And the diversity of models, so whether they, for instance, you can have a DSG model with an equilibrium solution and then have a lot of alpha equilibrium models, this diversity of models will be able to better guide your policy choices. So what's one of the options for doing this? One of the options that's somewhat recent is to take macroeconomic agent-based models. And so in the DSG model, we try to model things like by a representative agent that solves an optimization problem. And here we take sort of an inverse approach. We're trying to explicitly capture each of the agents of the economy. So we model each of them effectively individually, growing the whole system from the bottom up by solving over time. To make this concrete, you define a population of agents. So now we're no longer using representation, we're using, for instance, thousands of individual households, firms, banks, the central bank, the government, various institutions. We define their states, wealth, income, skills of some sort, and their behavioral rules, so how they choose, for instance, to make savings decisions. And then we define market properties. And this is one of the features of ABMs that's very starkly different from sort of the DSG approach, is that we explicitly define protocols for how these agents interact between one another, whether that is from the firm to household or within one another. So, for instance, firm to firm interactions in the net. And then as opposed to trying to solve this at an aggregate level, we simulate all of these agents individually, and then only afterwards to aggregate, define what the overall production is, inflation levels, and the like. And so this can sound very complicated. It can be simple. So for instance, in the Monasterolo model, you have thousands of firms, but you still sort of at an aggregate level model households, a bank, central bank, and you only have consumption in labor markets. And nonetheless, with these models, you get generate a rich set of phenomena, and they're useful for monetary policy analysis, which is one of the papers that we'll show you later on. But you can also, just as proof of concept, calibrate this on the entire country of Austria, which was done by a guy called Sebastian Polena, and is now in use, recalibrated to Canada, but it's in use at the Bank of Canada. And so here you really have this sort of trying one-to-one to match households, firms, and their interactions. Okay, so this sounds nice. We're sort of trying directly to model all of these 6 properties with heterogeneous agents interacting in the local sense. We're not trying to solve this model in a equilibrium sense. But nonetheless, this model is also not the solution to everything. It has its own set of critiques that some of which I'm trying to address with my research. The first is the critique of the wildness of bounded rationality, where a person being asked, these models, are they founded on real economic theory? Which basically goes to say, like, okay, well, how do you choose the individual behavioral rules? Where do they come from? Incidentally, a lot of the behavioral rules do actually mimic types of rules seen in DSG models, as far as, for instance, pricing the Tesco. What I'm more interested in is the idea that these models are being critiqued as black boxes. Because you have so many agents, because you're simulating this over time, and the aggregate phenomena you're generating are relatively nonlinear and stochastic, they've been critiqued as basically like, okay, what is the causality structure of these models? Where does the phenomena that you generated come from? And especially, can you just generate any phenomena? So people, that's one of the questions I've also been asked frequently, is that when I show this graph on the right, you have the unemployment rate for the Monasterolo model, you can already see that there's 3 key different phenomena. You can have a full employment case of almost 0% unemployment. You can have these very large endogenous oscillations, and you can have various levels of residual unemployment where, say, only 60% of the population is working. So we were like, well, if you can generate anything, how is this very rigorous? Because you can make anything happen. And the final problem with these models effectively is that because they're so large and intensive, it's hard to calibrate and estimate their parameters. Again, partially because you have to calibrate a lot of parameters on variable data, but also because it takes a long while to run. And in so doing, I want to address sort of what is the set of phenomena that you can generate with the model, just to answer the direct critique of you can't just generate anything with these models, and try to shed light a bit upon what drives their dynamics. So to illustrate a bit what I mean with complex phenomena, one of the first models we worked on with the paper in 2022 was this idea of capital demand-driven business cycles, where we took, for the economists in English, a very simple solo setting, and introduced basically investor-to-investor interaction that determines the level of capital in the model. And this model, in fact, is able to be written as a set of aggregate equations, but nonetheless, you have a very complicated dynamic. So the best example of this is in the top right figure where you can see that there's effectively two attractors in this economy. You have an attractor around people and organisms around basically investing and letting the economy expand over time. And you have an attractor around contraction, sort of where the sentiment of investors is low and they stop investing. And so slowly over time, because of depreciation in this model, the economy will contract. And you end up with this idea of a covariance resonance mechanism, where even if you have small noise in decisions and process that doesn't really change over time, in its amplitude, you can push between these sort of expansionary and contractionary dynamics, which, if you see in the bottom right graph, leads to this kind of bistable phenomenology, which can be complicated. And now we can take this one step further and go to one of the types of models, this real business cycle setup. That was one of the foundations of sort of the DSG approach, and introduce sort of investment, well, in this case, household-to-household interactions, where the households themselves are self-reflexive. So, and the simple way of saying this is, keep it up with the Joneses. If you're saving a lot of money, then I tend to have a higher savings rate, and vice versa, as well as the sense of an exuberance for investment, where if you're investing a lot, I'm more likely to invest a lot. And in this case, too, out of a model that typically displays an equilibrium, which you can see in the top left-hand side of the graphic, where you have like sort of a positive consumption, nice rational equilibrium, you end up extending the model just by allowing interactions of individual households to three different phenomenology. One where you can have sort of a coordination on very low consumption, and different types of crises, whether those are driven by not wanting to consume a lot or there not being a lot of activity. So in all of these models, we have multiple different phases. But given a model generically, especially macroeconomic agent-based model as complicated is, can we sort of, in a way, if you give me a model, say, okay, I will find a method to tell you what kinds of things this model can generate. And so the goal, in a sense, is to try to efficiently explore a macroeconomic agent-based model, and its complicated dynamics, to look through their parameter space and understand what are the different phases, how robust are they, do a lot of parameters lead to the same type of outcome, or is it a very niche single parameter set phase? What transitions between, for instance, full employment and endogenous crises are there? What drives these? And potentially one can extend this method later on to also reduce the dimensionality of the systems once you know sort of what are the drivers of the different phases. In a sense, what I'm trying to do is create a phase diagram. So for the physicists in the room, this will be very familiar. This is the phase diagram of water, where you have the three different states, solid, liquid, gas. And you can see you have transition lines between these that, for instance, gas or liquid will be evaporation. And so what I'm trying to do is effectively, in a sort of more agnostic, automatic manner, just recover these phases and their transition. How do we approach this? Well, we take a sidestep from economics to biophysics, and we introduce the idea that many models are sloppy. In fact, these are some of the key insights here. And what does it mean for a model to be sloppy? Well, it means that there is effectively, if you look at the parameter space of models, there are sloppy and stiff directions. So there's a few stiff directions, combinations of parameters, where if you perturb a model in this direction, you will have a large change in your observable. And there's a lot of sloppy directions, combinations of parameters, where if you perturb the model in this sloppy direction, the observables largely will remain totally unchanged. This does not mean that the person who created this model did a terrible job and did a sloppy job of making a model, because the way we parameterize models is, for instance, we pick economically meaningful parameters, savings rates, markup rates, marginal propensities, but it's actually the combination, some of the combinations of these parameters that are the stiff directions and the sloppy directions. Okay, so if you want to do this graphically, consider this sort of plane. Each of the ovals here sequentially represents an equilibrium. So within a given oval, basically you have the same degree of change compared to the central starting point I star. And you can see that basically what we're trying to find is V1 directions. So you see that small perturbations in this V1 direction will lead to large changes in observables, whereas you need an equivalently extremely large change into a V2, a sloppy direction, to generate a similar degree of change in the observable. So taking our starting point, put this into a bit more of a formalism, we effectively start at this point 5 star. And then if you pick a generic loss function, we will later work with both Kullback-Leibler divergence and mean squared error, and you perturb the model into a direction delta phi, then a second order expansion at this point delta phi equals 0 will lead you to basically say that the loss function locally can be approximated by using this Hessian matrix. Why? You might think that there's gradients, but actually just definitionally, because we're comparing the point, the true point phi star is the minimum, and so the first order terms all vanish. What this means is that it's quite nice because it means we can identify these stiff directions as the first eigenvector of this Hessian matrix. And the degree of stiffness or sloppiness is given by the eigenvalues. And this means that we can study how sloppy is a model, how many directions have a large effect and how many have very little effect by looking at the spectrum of eigenvalues, and the directions themselves are given by the associated eigenvectors. Now, why do we care about this idea from biophysics with my question about macroeconomic agent-based model? Well, if there's only a handful of sensitive directions, then this leads me to believe that if I'm looking for the set of different phenomena, then if I can identify this direction, sequentially put the model in these directions, then I should be generating a set of maximally different dynamics because I'm effectively going in the direction that changes the observables by the highest degree. It also has implications for calibration, which was one of the critiques of agent-based models, because if you can constrain these stiff, very sensitive directions using data, that means that even if the individual parameters vary over a large confidence interval, the actual predictions of the models tend to be quite good. Okay, so this was a nice sort of theoretical approach. So let's look at a very simple example called Kirman's ants. So imagine you have a very large number of ants and two different food sources, a source A and a source B. And these ants are distributed between these two food sources. Effectively, at any given point in time, you take a given ant, and at a rate mu, they randomly switch food sources from A to B or B to B. If that doesn't happen, you at a rate mu, basically take another ant and say this ant might recruit you at a rate mu. And so this means there's a model, it has two parameters. And you can see that if we study the proportion of ants at point A, you can either have a very high degree of random switching versus recruiting, and you sort of get this noisy time series. Or you can have a high degree of recruiting versus random switching, and you see that there's some biasability in the sense that ants will remain at one food source for a while and then all jump to the other. You can describe this distribution of ants using a beta distribution that depends only on the ratio of parameters, on the ratio of recruitment to random switching to recruitment. And so to illustrate defining stiff and sloppy directions in this model, if you compare to the distribution of using two different parameter sets, using here the symmetric Kullback-Leibler conversions, what you will find is that you get a first eigenvector, a stiff direction with a non-zero eigenvalue. That gives you basically locally exactly the fact that if you change the ratio, you change the distribution. It also gives you, because we have two parameters, a sloppy direction, the second eigenvector, where you can see that if you change the individual parameters without changing the ratio, nothing will happen because the distribution of the ants depends only on the ratio. So this is kind of a nice way of saying that if we can identify these stiff directions, we find out sort of what drives the change in the model. But of course, this model has two parameters, and so we can do all of this analytically, and that's very nice. So it has been demonstrated in non-economic contexts that models are, in fact, also high parameter models tend to be sloppy. So what you can see here is for a wide selection of different models from the natural sciences, the eigenvalue spectrum. So they're trying to understand the degree of sloppiness of these models. And you can see that in almost all cases, that will span over 6 decades, sort of in log terms, where there's only a handful of eigenvectors and eigenvalues, where you have sort of this very high eigenvalue, and the rest relative to that are more or less unimportant. Okay, so we have the case that this seems to work for the models from the natural sciences. So let's apply this approach to a macroeconomic agent-based model. And for that, we go and we select the Mark 0 model, which was an initial simplification of the Mark 1 family to study a phase transition in dimensions. Why? Well, it has 22 parameters, which allows me to run the model rather frequently compared to some much larger agent-based models. And more importantly, it has multiple known phase transitions. So I already introduced you to this diagram of the unemployment rate, where you have full employment, almost zero unemployment, residuals, or oscillations. And some of the transitions between these different phrases are known. So for instance, the boundary threshold would be one parameter that governs one of these transitions. And the nice thing is, I can apply sort of my stiff enthalpy analysis to this and already know, okay, well, there's different phases, can I identify these phases? But to do that, let me first show you that this model is indeed a sloppy model. That is, on the far left-hand side, you can see what happens when you take these 22 parameters and compute the eigenvalue spectrum. So you have the case that you have one eigenvector, the stiff direction, and you have a lot of other directions in the parameter space that are comparatively relatively unimportant. You can see, in fact, it spans over 9 decades as far as the eigenvalues go. So in the central panel, you can see what are the eigenvectors associated with, in this case, the first 9 eigenvalues, even though the 9th eigenvalue will be relatively unimportant compared to the first. And you can see that in most cases, you get a combination of parameters, which means this is to say that what we're really studying is parameter combinations, not necessarily individual parameters that are stiff or sloppy. You can have the case, for instance, in the central panel, where only the propensity to consume out of income is the relevant direction for the residual case, but more often than not, you get combinations of parameters. Okay, so as far as the estimation of this goes, what we actually did is we made this model differentiable. So we implemented it in a way that you can calculate the true Jacobians and Hessians, which actually also means that for the case of Mark 0, you only actually need 150 time steps and 1 random realizations to get the structure of these eigenvectors and the eigenvalue spectrum in a relatively consistent manner, with the exception of the case where you have this nice endogenous crises. Because in this case, using the mean squared error that we're using, you have an exponential sensitivity because you can shift the frequency slightly. And so if you have more and more time, you basically increase the loss a lot. But for this case, even the eigenvectors here too are relatively consistent. Okay, so effectively, what I've shown you is that there are sloppy models. We pick the Monasterolo agent-based model, and this model too is sloppy. Now, at some point, someone might ask, what about the PSG models we introduced in initially? Well, these models too fall under the category of being sloppy. That is, if you use the parameters. So here I've taken 3 sort of classic models from postgraduate textbooks and 3 models that are calibrated models that form the basis of some of the models used in central banks. If you apply the same methodology to these models and try to identify sort of there's the parameter directions stiff and sloppy, you get a similar case where the eigenvalue spectrum will span for 6 decades. So this seems to be a relatively generic phenomenon, even in these models. And you can see here too, on the right-hand side, for 2 examples that we're talking about parameter combinations as being the driving factors. Okay, so we've identified stiff and sloppy directions of high sensitivity. But how does this relate back to the question of trying to discover the different set of phenomena in a macroeconomic ABA? And so I've introduced this idea a little bit already, but the main idea is that if we want to understand the set of possible different phenomena, then I kind of wish to create a set of different points in the parameter space whose output dynamics or observable dynamics are as different as possible from one another. And I know that locally at any given point in the parameter space, I can identify the most sensitive direction using the stiff direction. And so if I perturb the model in this direction, I will get something that should be maximally different from where I started. And so the idea is that even though this is just a local phenomenon, we can do this sequentially to try to create this series of points in parameter space that give you this maximally different set of observed outputs. And so effectively what I'm trying to do is, in a clever way, sample the parameter space. So as a measure for this, I just use the mean squared error over the time series we observed. And it leaves us with a couple of decisions to make. In the first instance, how far do I perturb the models? Now, in theory, we could use the eigenvalues for this. In this case, I've used a fixed step size. We need to decide on the sign of the eigenvector because it is indeterminate. I've tried both in a random sense and trying to use essentially the stopping criterion where you compare sort of whether the pairwise differences in all of the observed dynamics. Once that starts to decrease, you're just adding things you've seen already, and then you stop. Okay, so before we get into the realizations of sort of this more algorithmic approach, I wish to ground your idea of sort of what are the outcomes of the Marx-Zero model. So in the literature, one of the ways that parameter space sampling is typically done is to run something like a Sobol sequence. So you're trying to uniformly sample this n-dimensional parameter space. If you apply this to the Marx-Zero model with 32,768 different samples, then you kind of get a picture in the space of observables. So here I'm considering the mean unemployment rate and the standard deviation of unemployment, where the different shaded regions represent the different phases that you can find. So you have in blue a full employment phase, in green endogenous crises, in red residual employment, and in gray full unemployment or collapse of the whole economy. You see that uniformly sampling the parameter space of the model does not necessarily uniformly sample the observed output of the model. In fact, you get almost 50% of your samples will be in some sense of either collapsing the model or leaving it in a full unemployment state. The next largest being mostly full employment, and then you get a much lower degree of sampling the interesting phases of endogenous oscillations or residual unemployment. And so the question is, can we do better? Can we try to get sort of a uniform sampling of the space of observables vis-a-vis the space of parameters? And so if we run this algorithmic approach that I introduced to you a couple slides ago, where we sequentially perturb the model's parameters in the stiffest directions locally, then what we're looking for is a very noisy graph because we want to generate as many different phenomena as you possibly can. And in fact, taking two strategies, so either randomly assigning the eigenvector vector or picking the most different to already previously observed direction, then you can see, probably the best in this bottom panel, that you can identify a variety of different phases just by doing this sequential. So you can see here in the bottom right, we have in this light yellow, you have several full employment cases. You have cases of endogenous oscillations, some with very high peaks of various types, some that we haven't studied before. You have residual unemployment cases, and you can even basically perturb the model into sort of a full unemployment state. And so it basically seems to be the case that just doing something simple like this, where you use the local information on how much the model can be changed, you can discover the set of different phenomena. So effectively answering the first question of what is the set of different phenomena. Now, there's no guarantee that this is universally the total global set of different phenomena you can get with the model, because we are only effectively using local approximations. But comparing it to basically true uniform sampling of the parameter space, this does seem to be the case. Another point of interest is that you can't truly generate anything with these models. So all of these phases fall under one of the classifications I gave you before. You can't just sort of arbitrarily shift or generate nonlinear dynamics like you choose. So you can do this in this case with fixed initial conditions, but you can also try to do this by looking more at the steady states of model or trying to really understand that, kind of get rid of this fact that if you keep your initial conditions fixed, you will get a lot of transitions between different phases. You can also let this run all the way to the steady state, and then compute the stiffest directions, perturb, and then let the model run a long period again until the steady state, and then study only those. And in this case, too, you find the variety of the different phases and you're able to recover this. Okay, so going back to what I showed you earlier, which is that uniformly sampling the parameter space does not necessarily lead to uniform sampling the phase space. If you take the same plot and now use all of the outputs of this sort of sequential algorithmic approach, you find that as far as the coverage rates go, you're now no longer oversampling the full employment cases, but you get a more even spread across the phases as identified. In this case, the choice of phase transition lines was given by the original authors. And so actually, you can get a more uniform sampling of the space of observables, the phenomena that I'm interested in, vis-a-vis the space of parameters. So with that, effectively, kind of answered the first research question: what are the different phenomena? But this leaves open the question of what drives these phenomena. What are the actual sort of directions that you picked within each phase? So, taking a variety of starting points and a variety of steps in these algorithms, what you can see here is the first eigenvector of the direction we picked in each of these explorations, just across all of the explorations done, with the only condition being that we start in the full employment case. So the question we're effectively asking here is like, in the full employment case, if I want to change the unemployment dynamics, is the parameter combination I need to perturb relatively consistent? And indeed, you find that wherever in the full employment phase you are, you get several parameters, namely the price and wage adjustment dynamics, the consumption propensity out of income of households, and the target inflation rate that seem to crop up as sort of the sensitive combination of parameters, irrespective of where in the parameter space you are. And this is quite nice because it doesn't necessarily mean you can reparameterize the model, but as far as if you're interested, for instance, in as a central bank doing monetary policy and how to shift the unemployment rate closer to your target, then these effectively in your model are the directions you should focus. But these choices of directions also are phase dependent. So you have this idea of a phase dependent identity. Namely that while in the full employment case, you have price and wage adjustment dynamics, and the propensity to consume out of income is the driving sort of combination of parameters. If you then go to one of the oscillating phases, so the endogenous crises case, you actually find that the respective sensitive combination of parameters is still relatively consistent, but now includes a lot of different parameters compared to full employment. So in this case, we observe, for instance, high dependence on F, which is how bankruptcies are allocated between banks and households, as well as the actual bankruptcy threshold in the model. And so you, depending on which phenomena you're interested in, at least in the Mark Zero model, you can use this kind of approach also to get an idea of within this given phenomenon, these are sort of the directions to push to change the outcome dynamic. Now, this was all sort of very general about the single model. Let's apply this also a bit more to the case of inflation, which I introduced initially as part of the predictive. So last year in 2023, we extended the Mark Zero to include an energy price dynamic and dynamic inflation expectations, and then applied three shocks that were from an energy price shock, a supply shock, and basically consumption shock. And we did this to try to study within the context of this model the effectiveness of monetary policy, because there was a lot of debate at the time about whether or not to raise interest rates and whether that would be effective at inflation dynamics. And we found that at least in the context of our model, the actual reaction of inflation depends much more on the degree to which the expectations of the individual agents, in this case mostly firms, are anchored to the central bank's target, whether they truly believe that the central bank will basically act and all inflation will be 2%, or whether they do not care at all about what the central bank's target is by itself. So how does Soutenance, or the idea of Sethna and sense of prime directions relate to this? Well, as part of our study, we also considered, when we took our set of parameters and estimated the different stopping directions. Actually, what we find by doing that is, if you recall this full employment case, I told you that the wage and price dynamics are one of the stiff directions. What you find is that if you employ this and perturb the parameters, you actually discover this phase transition between effectively having a stable or returning to target inflation rate, separated from a hyperinflation state. That is, when you have an imbalance in the wage and price adjustment to inflation, effectively what can happen is that the prices will adjust much more than the wages will, and you end up effectively destroying the economy. Whereas if they're sort of anchored together and their expectations are set, then you can return the inflation rate back down to what your target was. So all of that being said, what I've tried to, or what the 3 years of research have yielded is that effectively macroeconomic MABMs here in the form of the Mark Zero model appear to be slow. So their dynamics at the given space depend only on a handful of stiff directions. So we can exploit these stiff directions if we have estimated them to generate a set of maximally different phenomena. That is, we can try to recover what are the different phenomena. Now, of course, this method has its limitations. Most notably, we generally work with the mean squared error as a loss function. But this has a limitation due to the fact that if you have oscillating regimes, you can change the frequency slightly and generate a very large loss, even though you're not changing the phenomenon you're observing. And the second limitation is that all of these estimations of stiff and sloppy directions, while in a Marx theory they are relatively consistent across a given phase, are still only a local approximation of this sort of lost surface. So this, together with the case of the macroeconomics models that I studied, where you can have this small shock/cycles phenomenon, as Benzaquen called it, where changes in hormones can quickly change economic dynamics, and you have very important monetary fiscal interactions, leads to a variety of things that one can obviously still continue to work on in this regime. The most notable is to take a probabilistic approach. So with the mean squared error, we've taken a direct time series to time series comparison. I want to consider the exact time series, which is relatively agnostic. But we can also do this sort of looking at the distribution, whether that's the distribution of unemployment rate, or say the probability of unemployment falling in a given equation. And in this case, you should be relatively immune to various noise effects together with shifts in frequency, because if they shift the frequency of the oscillation, the actual distribution should change. So that's one sort of very practical thing to use. But more importantly, we can identify different phases, but it would also be nice to reduce the model's dimensionality for this given phase. So if I'm in a full employment phase and I want to have a simpler model that describes this phase, we can actually start studying these sloppy directions. Because if you recall, a stiff direction means small change in parameters leads to a large change in observables. Sloppy directions, if you have a large change of parameters that tend to not change the output a lot. What this means is that if you take these sloppy directions and effectively sequentially start perturbing these until the parameters containing them can be very large, then what has been also found in part of the biophysics literature is that you end up being able to eliminate some combinations of parameters. So an example of this would be if you have a forward rate for a reaction and backward rate, much like with the ants, maybe only their ratio matters. And so by taking these sloppy directions, you can start replacing two parameters with, say, one, which is just their ratio, and thus start slowly pruning the parameter space of these very highly dimensional models. And finally, one of the fun things we did quite at the end of my PhD was to make this model differentiated. That is, I can run this model, and as I run it, I know what the gradients, all of the gradients are, and so it makes both calibration and computation of these stiff and sloppy directions computationally a lot easier. Now, most macro MABMs that I've come across are not written in a differentiable manner, which means you have a very high computational cost for doing most of these approaches, including calibration. And so further pushing this sort of implementation direction would open up a lot of avenues as far as calibration and understanding these models. So that's all the methodologies. But of course, we've also only primarily studied the Marx theory. I've worked with a couple other models, but nothing in the publication yet. But what I'm most interested in is sort of agent-based integrated assessment models. I'm trying to link sort of the climate economics finance nexus, whether that is sort of an agent heterogeneity in emissions or, for instance, inequality approaches, financial risks that might emerge from climate dynamics. And the idea that with agent-based approaches, you can also relieve yourself of taking an aggregate dynamic function and just say, okay, well, GDP will decrease by some factor, but you can shock the individual agents. So one model that is in the literature actually shocks the capital level of each individual agent, and so you can allow for sort of geographic diversity in this as well. And then finally, I have worked on several models specifically, and in this case, again, I'm still interested primarily in the effects of sort of the financial intermediation aspect. So for instance, in the Marx theory model, taking also the fact that the central bank will change the interest rate and how this passes through the banking system into firms' loan rates, as opposed to more direct. And so with that, I wanted to thank the jury for paying attention and all my collaborators, particularly Max and Ilya, who I've worked quite intensely with. And then for those people that are not in the jury that wish to ask any questions, you can feel free to email.
Thank you. Then I think we will open a question, maybe starting James Sethna is online. He was one of the rapporteurs of the thesis.
Go for it, Jim. The floor is open for you to ask me questions.
Oh, well, I feel very comfortable with your presentation. I'm not sure I have any particular questions. As I said,
You can also
as-
give me comments. Comments are also
say again.
Question?
questions or comments. Both we take it all.
Excellent, excellent. So there were a few things in this project that I was particularly impressed with. One of them was that your sloppy spectrum, which of course does depend on what parameters you had, seemed to have very clear relationships with the three phases. And in retrospect, that makes sense, that if you're in a phase with high unemployment constantly, then the bankruptcy rate doesn't matter. But more broadly, it suggests that the behavior space in the model manifold is basically three different model manifolds for each phase, which is a wonderful picture. Now, you didn't directly do that, but it's very clear from the evidence of your simulation that this is likely to be happening, and so we should be looking for model reduction, not for the whole model, but for descriptions of the individual phases, which could be very fascinating. And then your adaptation of eigenvalue analysis to stochastic systems is as far as I know unique. That automatic using automatic differentiation, in not to say that you're the first to use automatic differentiation, but you're first to use it to find stiff and sloppy directions and explore parameter space. And I think that's just fascinating.
Thank you.
Thanks. So then I think we follow the order while I still there. So then after Jason, I have Francois. Should you want to take the floor? Then I say Irene, and then myself, or no, then Alan, then myself, then the PhD.
Sure. I thought you wanted me to speak after the rapporteur.
Because I am the president and the rapporteur, so then we need to speak twice.
I see. Okay. So yes. So I must say I was very impressed by the thesis. I mean, both like in terms of content, but also in how pleasant it is to actually read. I mean, I must say that it's the most clear thesis I've ever read. So it's, you don't need to read twice to understand what you mean. So it's really nice as a reader and very unusual. And also in terms of the depth. So I know, I mean, it's very unusual for me because you both have a contribution in terms of the methods and like but also you apply it, like it's not just like a proof of concept or like so I thought, I mean, the thesis overall is very nice. So of course I have a few questions and also perhaps a few complaints, but the complaints are not your fault in a sense, because the complaints are about where you try to stick the most, I think, to the mainstream economic, model, and I think that's where there's the largest numbers of questions. So, but in a sense, it's not your fault, right? It's like I mean, it makes sense that you're playing the game and also trying to speak to economists. But I mean, very often I feel that. So perhaps first as a question, but it's not an easy question, but something in the back of my mind is how you make the connection in general with the data in terms of these models. So typically, most of the ways I think that you confront the model generated dynamics with the data is through unconditional moment, like unconditional. And I think that it's both a question for yours, but also of macro models in general. Is we have a lot of data on conditional moments as well, because you often have the same types of shocks, like a fiscal shock, a monetary policy shock, or things like that. And we know very well how different things respond. And I think for someone of your background, it would be interesting to see more systematically how we could use both in the sense like do both like unconditional and conditional, and how to see how the model fits, like how much weight to put on both, and like what's the, I feel, and in general, you talk about, you say, we know that the financial crisis cannot be about a shock or like, it has to be something much more like endogenous to the system and so on. But there also, I think what's interesting is that initially, perhaps there is a shock, which is like, you have like a strong increase in the rates of monetary policy from 2006 to 2009. You have many discussions about like whether this led to the financial crisis, but clearly you have an effect on household disposable income, and this is something that is present in the model and so on. Then there might be some amplification and so on, but sometimes I feel, so it's unlike in physics, I think there are some, so the problem with the mainstream like DSG models is that we take exogenous shocks, which like Romer calls like floating stuff, and I think it's a very nice way that there's really no excuse for doing that, because they are macro shocks that we can identify. We know their source, we know their magnitude, and so on, and we never have them in the models, which is a bit weird. And so I was wondering whether you could go one step in this direction. I know it's not at all what you did in this thesis and so on, but at the same time, it's just a suggestion if you want future work in. That's just something in the back of my mind. And since you're very efficient at solving the problems that are apparently confronted to you, I thought I would bring you this problem, because I feel you have the technical capabilities to like answer this type of question. Like in general, so of course I was more, I was extremely interested when you talk about DSG models, because I have there's a lot of people that complain about them, but they complain about them in the open, but at the same time, you talked about Blanchard, for example. At the same time, he defends them very strongly. So you put like the one quote where he criticizes them, and he's one of the person who's actually responsible for saying we should not get rid of them. So I felt it was a bit, in the critics, if you take Stiglitz, for example, he's much more actually critical, and so I was wondering, like, what do you, so like, for example, when you take the solo model and when you add another layer, which is actually extremely interesting, I was interested in, what do you get if you get, instead of getting a solo, do you get like a Roth-Domar structure, which is the entier from the beginning, which is with the capital cessation, which would interact with the mechanism that you have, but it's already something that you had in fact before solo. So I was wondering what happens if you interact those two deviations rather than just one. That's another question I had. Then I was, in the COVID paper, I was very much interested in that. So you talk a lot about inflation expectations, and in the end, that's where you. But again, I would be interested with knowing a bit more the connection with the data. You have all these papers by like Gordinchenko and that show that actually when you ask for a manager, they just have no idea even what inflation is or what the average rate of inflation is. And so it seems to contradict a bit, what the mechanisms are told that are in these models. And so in general, you stick very much to the stories that are, there is even a Phillips curve, so as you may know, I'm not a big fan of the Phillips curve and so on in the paper, but in the sense, the stuff that I found really fascinating was really where you add some physics and some really like unusual for me, like elements and so on, but where of course you're more neoclassical and so on, I was a bit less convinced, because I've been thinking about these models and more I think it really doesn't make any sense. But overall, you know, the other thing that's really nice is that I mean, clearly you can tell you have a physics background because all your models are homogeneous. You know, you can know what the units are, and so I mean, at least it makes sense in terms of homogeneity and so on. And to be honest, I think this is something which is lacking a lot from a lot of economic models. And so this is also very nice because it makes it much easier to understand, actually, I thought. And so you know, maybe to sort of sorry, I'm just checking because I put notes on the checking that I didn't forget anything. But like yeah, so yeah, so yeah, so in general, you know, you talked about heterogeneous. So you differentiated like your approach to the DSG approach by saying in agent-based models we have multiple agents interacting. I think perhaps it's a bit sort of unfair to the most recent literature. I mean that you cite like the Henk models and so on. But I think it would be interesting perhaps to go a bit more in details about what's wrong with these models. I mean, you said what's wrong with DSG models, but there's many things that are wrong with Henk models as well that justify, I think, an ABM approach, which is much better and much more reasonable and realistic. But I think it would be perhaps for a reader that's not a priori, you know, critical or who has not thought about these things. I think it would be interesting to just explain what are the differences and why you don't like these ways of introducing heterogeneity, which, you know, is still in the Lucas critique, is still rational expectations and so on. It's much more, of course, you know, it's very highly infinitely neat and so on. And to finish with, I was wondering whether the sort of, you know, there was in the mainstream at some point, there was an attempt to have like overlapping generations models, like assume that the people actually die, which is a reasonable assumption, I think. And that was a way to actually have heterogeneity just because you have age, you know, and so already people are, and so in a sense, these models were not really, didn't have a following, in part, I think, for computational reasons, because they appeared basically in the 80s and the 90s, where it was much harder to like do this computational experiment. I was wondering whether you could potentially address the questions that they were interested in a more ABM approach. Again, that's more work than it's more work than questions, but it's just suggestions, perhaps, because I think that's what you'll do. I mean, given how easy it seems for you to do these type of things, I think that OLG models would be perhaps a way. You know, there's many questions you can address in those, like the pension system, the public debt, and so on, which are also at the forefront of discussions. And so I was thinking of a last comment, but yes, so what OLG models? Yes, so yeah, I mean, sorry. So that's so I'm going to end there. And yes, exactly. So that's I would like to say, you know, that honestly, so I shouldn't say that because of course it's not nice to people who for whom I was referring before and so on. But to be honest, this is at least one of the best theses I would say that I've ever read. So I think it's, you know, it's extremely nice, extremely impressive in terms of your maturity, of how well you know both fields in a sense. Because, you know, in economics, of course, I have some complaints, and if you want, we can discuss it if you want. But, you know, honestly, for someone who spends most of his time not reading economics papers, I'm guessing.
I do actually in economics.
Yes.
My concentration then I define economics, and so all of the things I know about physics I've learned exclusively in the PhD.
I see.
Yes,
so that's unusual. So many people actually do sometimes the opposite, right?
Yes.
But I mean, you can tell that you master really like the two subjects, and so again, it's extremely impressive. So it's great.
Thanks. How do you want to touch your points?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good points. I mean, for for Hank particularly, because Hank always comes up when you say talk about ABMs and the fact that they have heterogeneity, because then that's typical response that people, well, you have Hank moments. And I think my main response, which I didn't go in depth in this presentation, is just that both the types of interactions, whether that's even the fact that for an ABM you need to have a market protocol, like you need to have a way for firms of households to interact, because they're not automatically saying, okay, well, we'll match the aggregates together. So that by itself increases the degree of heterogeneity in a way that you cannot capture if you're solving just by an aggregate equilibrium. But then I also find it's much easier to add different layers of heterogeneity. So like with Hank, you can do like income type heterogeneity, and usually I'm not super in depth familiar with the Hank literature, but you have like 1 or 2 degrees of heterogeneity more than like basically a whole spectrum of having different skills and incomes and wealth and backgrounds.
And it's by setting.
Yes.
It's set.
Yeah, it's also
it's not endogenous behavior.
Yeah, exactly. Which is the other part of ABM, which is like even if you initialize everyone, for instance, on the marks here with the same initial conditions, so like in theory, you could capture them all by like saying, okay, well, there's an average agent. If you run it 5 steps, they're all going to be different. Some more different in some regards than others, but yeah, you do, in a sense, just by having like smart protocol type interaction, you end up with heterogeneity, whether you want it or not. Which I think was also like, I do remember that I think it was actually one of Alan's papers of like, even if you start with a representative rational agent, then there's nothing to say that 2 periods on, like the second you allow them to take an action, they're not going to be like a representative anymore. So yeah, so that's one thing, which is also part of what I found interesting when you try to, because when I first started with the PhD, we tried to adapt sort of like whether it was a solo model or an RBC model, is that the second you start adapting them, you kind of need to be able to somehow get rid of, you can either do the RBC model with minor adaptations, or you have to get rid of the market clearing condition. If you want to start introducing the fact that you have inventories and all of these kinds of things with heterogeneous, with like multiple agents, and so then you're already all the way in ABM. So like the marriage between the two is very difficult. You're either in one camp or kind of in the other. But as far as what you say with moments, whether unconditional and conditional, I think that would be a very interesting question, because here I've always worked within the model to just understand the model itself before moving into data. But as far as like, for instance, the loss function goes, you can literally replace like the component parameter space and perturbation with the data. Whereas so you basically do what you normally do with like calibrating a model, and compare what you have as data with what your output is as a model. And then you can still study, and this was actually the original part of the original motivation for sloppy models, is you still have this type of sloppy model spectrum. And so you can still try to do one of 2 things. You can either try to understand sort of which are the more discriminating, like, well, prime combinations, but also observables, and you can try to understand like which to push them to the data. Because part of what I'm interested in too is that some of the observables, like especially if you go like the self-predictions, they don't change much. And so like if you're trying to calibrate, say, on the inflation, the average GDP growth rate, if that doesn't change much across many parameters in the models, it's probably not very discriminating observable. And so I think part of what I'd be interested in is, before even going to the data, is to take this, also try to study like what are the more discriminating as far as the parameters you're interested in. And that doesn't directly answer the question about moments and moments, but I think it's interesting to go from just within a model to all of this data. Yeah. And yeah. I mean, OLG models, I know what an OLG model is, but I haven't studied them in depth or read the literature in the background of what questions they're training.
Yeah.
And like, but they never remember. But
yeah, okay, guys. I think we'll make fun of that.
Okay, short one. So it's just that it's also like just in terms of the discussion, because I think that what economic physics in general is doing is great and should get more of a hearing in economics. But the way that the game that is played is that very often in an economic model, you also get multiple equilibrium and so on. The game is sort of to get rid of them because we don't like them. It's a bit sometimes the way that you write and so on, you say that it's a sort of a success that you're getting multiple equilibria and so on. And Roger Farman, for example, has tried, you know, to put equilibria in mainstream models and so on, and show them, you know, look, even in this model that you're using, there are actually multiple equilibria. Perhaps in order to just make more connection with them, it would be, I just think about the way that they're the way that they are uncomfortable with multiple equilibria, and also why they don't like it. In effect, is that they cannot, you know, they say it's sort of there is an anything goes sort of result, and that's criticism, which is, I think, an unfair criticism, because in the end they don't confront the model to the data anyway, or they confront in a very loose way. But I think that would be interesting, and interesting, sorry, and also perhaps think about the way that the parameters are estimated, not just through macro models, the fitting of the macro model, but through an auxiliary experiment where you have like quasi-experimental evidence. And I think this is something that's gaining more and more traction, like to measure the elasticity of labor supply, or to measure the propensity to consume. Would there be a way, again, to go back to conditional and so on, to just, you know, confront data to the theory in a more multidimensional way? Because there's many ways, I think, to learn about models than just the usual fitting, or, but again, that's more of an open question. But yeah.
I mean, just methodologically, there's also literature, because part of this came from physics and government to chemistry and things, is that obviously these people, like, the challenge there is that you have like hundreds of parameters in, say, 60 observations. And so, you know, there's already like the question. But you can also do, you can take this hundreds of parameter space and like optimally design experiments to sort of discriminate between all of those. And so that would probably tie into like how you could do quasi-experimental economics combined with this, because you can then take the model and say, okay, well, this is the most discriminating set of experiments. Some of them will probably be unfeasible just because we're looking at economics, but at least some would be feasible. And then, yeah, I mean, the multiple and like the sunspot equilibrium literature, part of the curiosity there is also like, you have multiple equilibria and you try to get rid of them, because there's also no answer to the question of like, even if you allow multiple equilibrium, how do you go from one to another? Because that's, well, at that point, you're no longer in an equilibrium. And so like, if you have a shock to the model, would you necessarily return to the place you were, or would you go somewhere?
So could you use your stiffness? Oh, sorry. But I was going to say, could you use your idea of stiffness to sort of design an optimal, like which are the parameters you want to learn about, sort of like these are the key parameters. I was curious when I read, of course, you didn't give all the details and so on, but which are the ones in the TSG? And but I can ask you.
So in the TSG, when we did this initially, you get a lot of the, whether you take the actual time series or the impulse response function shocks, you do get like the first few step deductions tend to include, or in the simpler models, from to remember best, is like you have the causal parameter of sigma crisis and the size of the sigma of the noise in the system. And so you basically get those. And so if you shift around the causal parameter, you basically shift around the impulse response, and the rest of it didn't really do much in combination. With the more complicated models, then like, I'm just trying to understand, but like that's part of the trickiness here, is because you end up with a combination. And so there's not necessarily an intuition about what the linear combination of like the marginal frequencies consuming plus causal pricing plus wage stickiness parameters, what that means. But you could, like I said, you try to do the reverse of studying the subtle directions and reduce the model, and then you can say, okay, well, for this space, these are the things actually you need to parameterize, and the rest probably not.
And it's interesting in terms of intuition to know that there's a connection between two of the parameters that you didn't expect.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
No problem. Maybe Irene,
Yeah, so it's complementary. So I talk from the macroeconomic side. So first of all, congratulations, because despite being an economist, I could read all your theses and so enjoy also the parts which were less straightforward to me. So that very good job. Well, I will take a kind of let's say complementary position to yours. So I really appreciate the fact that you address both and you played both with the DSG and agent-based models, because in order to be able to criticize another modeling approach, we should at least know how it works, and you know how it works only when you practice. So that's myself come from CG model, so that's that's the point. But so I really find it interesting, and also of course then your development in agent-based model, and for what's closer to me, the last part of your work on climate. So mostly I have two sets of questions. Some are more technical, and I think we will have it's only a relaxed version, then we'll have time to discuss in the further months. But the main so we have some more general questions which are related to, okay, so you analyze both and play both with ESGs and agent-based models, and you should have familiarized with the limits and strength of both. So when to use one and when to use the other. So, and the question is, so how much complexity do we need in the end of the story? In the end of the day, sorry, in order to represent the economy and finance as they are now, I mean, as an evolving complex system, while still being able to provide results that are meaningful for policymaking. Because, for instance, in your chapter 8, economic crisis in a model with capital scarcity and the self-reflective confidence, where you develop the model, actually you end up saying, and this might require, so one of the results is this might require the central bank to set interest rates to negative values, which is, I mean, if you're or even our model suggests that monetary authorities should also directly promote investments. But then, okay, to what extent this is, I mean, when we discuss results, to what extent these are desirable, I mean, these are meaningful then for policy. So the first point is that really, how do you deal with it, or what do you learn from your PhD thesis about the trade-off between complexity and policy relevance, and how to address this trade-off? And one, in order to identify how much complexity we need in order to be trusted, return some results that can be trusted by policymakers. We know they like stars, so to see the stars, so that's also the other point, the other problem. And then you talk about, so we talk about multiple equilibria, and one interesting feature of that is, of course, when you then look at the policy recommendation, and the policies usually you say, okay, one policy to address, but we know that in a complex world, one policy doesn't fit all. So you talked a bit briefly in your public paper about fiscal and monetary policy coordination. So if you can elaborate a bit on that. And the last point is about scenario analysis in agent-based models, and in particular climate scenarios. So you talk about integrated assessment models, integrated assessment agent-based models, which, for those who are not familiar with integrated assessment models, they are already not allied, but process-based integrated assessment models. So they are models composed of many different models, like land use, energy, transport, whatever. So the question here, and get back to my first question, why we need so much complexity, and why we should go for hard integration, when in contrast we could maybe use the inputs of the models in a way which is logically consistent, because we also consider that these models, we should consider these models have different logical, different assumptions and foundation. So process-based integrated assessment models have a Ramsey module, the agent-based model is very different. So why this choice? And well, could we think of something something different?
I think that kind of also relates to the how much complexity to be useful for policy question, right? In terms of, do we really need like an agent-based version of, I don't know, if you've watched Westfold, of the computer that knows every person and all of the physical.
Yeah, you mentioned also a paper that represented all households in Austria. I really don't believe that we need to represent each one as of the Austria because they somehow they could be grouped in classes at least.
I mean, in part, yes, like the simple answer would be it depends on which policy question you're answering. I think as far as like an ABM, especially when you're considering like distributional policies, I think it is rather important to have the complexity of having a lot of individual different agents. So whether that is in terms of studying like the specific structure, like unemployment, subsidies that go to different people, or for instance, if you study something, which is one of the projects we're working on now, where you have like an occupational network where you have many different occupations and people transition between different occupations and spend time on unemployment and that. Then you do kind of need this like large amount of agents, complexity, and interchange among them, because then you kind of want to study how individuals traverse these kind of like complicated networks. But then when you think about sort of more like say the process, like the integrated assessment models, I don't think you necessarily need to have the whole occupational network in every single firm in the economy in order to sort of represent something meaningful as far as policy goes. And so as far as the agent-based integrated assessment models that I've read through, so they are kind of lesser trying to respond to process-based ABM, more than like sort of Nordhaus dice approach, where
Which is let's say
which is by itself a terrible way of doing planned economics, if you will.
So it's like putting ketchup on pasta. Come on.
Yes, exactly. So that was the initial motivation for it, because you have, or like one of the main motivations for some of the models was the aggregate damage function approach, and the fact that like, I mean, I'm not familiar with all of the process-based ABMs, but as far as from the reviews of the literature that I am familiar with, like the economic parts of some of them are still very simple. And so you have this very complex land use model, or this very complex climate dynamics model, and then you end up with like sort of a Ramsey growth model. And you're like, well, I mean, at least for the economic part, we can do better. Whether that requires a full ABM, I don't necessarily think so. Also because climate issues are global, and so you have to make the global ABM, which just computationally is not feasible right now.
But why not consider taking the shocks from the from the
exactly. So that's
answer it in your economy.
Exactly. So that's like what I was going to, is to take okay, do what kind of you do with the normal integrated system. So you combine a bunch of them and say, okay, well, we have the complicated land use with our climate model, and then you just take the outputs from that and then use that as the trajectories. In a sense, I think that would be the most policy relevant. I do wonder, like, in terms of like, if you then have, for instance, like the emissions trajectories, so that there's like endogenous feedback, because from the economy to the emissions trajectory too, in the sense that you're not only changing if you take an emissions trajectory, say for that's a net zero base or a baseline case, and you study it you take it as living in the economic model, and then do policies, then also potentially, ideally, your policies, for instance, in Hoppe's world, you might change the trajectory of the emissions as well. And so you'd have feedback for the climate model, which at the specific point at which that interacts or something might change the way that the climate model gets.
But did you take the emission goal? Then you at the end of the
you see how close
simulation, and you see how endogenous you get there.
But that is to say, I don't think you need like a whole global APM. I don't think you need a full set of complexity. In fact, I would, so when I first started with APMs, there was the people who were like, we agentize everything. So we start out with all the agents from all the household agents, everything is agents. And I quickly came to a group that was like basically called inverse generative social science. So you do agentization instead. So you say something like, even as simple as the good growth model or like SFC model, and you say, okay, well, for the person I'm studying, maybe I need many agents. So like you agentize only the firm sector or only the household if you're interested in income distribution type questions. And so you work with that. So you have like a framework of essential model that you can still kind of, get your head around in 1 or 2 papers. And then you agentize parts of that depending on what you want to study. I mean, that's kind of also what Mark Zero does. Like it agentizes the firm sectors, but leaves households in the bank and the central bank as an aggregate phenomenon, because like it was the firm interactions that were the interesting part. And so I think that would be the approach, not just the bottom up agentize everything immediately, but to take sort of like a aggregate model and then agentize different parts of it.
This would allow also you to control better the results and
yes, exactly. And for that, like, systems dynamics or software system models are some better approach for agentization, because again, with the DSG, what I was done before is like you immediately need to sort of invoke like a whole set of market protocols, and so you can't use the aggregation that you normally have in the DSG, where you have like, say you need the household representative and you need the firm. It doesn't quite work together when you have like individual heterogeneous agents, because then you're like, okay, well, how do they necessarily interact with each of the different firms? Or at least it's fine. I mean, like you can do something like where you have the firm network, but then it's a static representation. The network itself is static. So, yeah, that would be my sort of long-winded response to that. For those questions.
Yeah, and maybe just short, sure.
I think that means
Well, we can. So you work both on DSGs and agent-based models. So how would you define the issue of persistency of the shock? For instance, in GDP level versus GDP growth in the two.
I see. Well, I mean, with the MABM, you can certainly have, infinitely persistent shock depending on what the response of the agents in the model is. So if we part of, for instance, with the COVID paper, we studied how persistent, like the inflation before we started with full employment, so steady state, and we shock the model, and then it does take, in some cases, up to 10 years to get back to like, where essentially you have the initial shocks and then you have the policy response, but then you have like an oscillatory return to where the original steady state is. And so you do get extremely persistent shocks. And I remember one of, I forget the technical term for it, but in a sense, like with the DSG, it's like you are in a world where like you have a shock, and then by solving the model in this equilibrium sense, you have like basically just like you're saying that the agents coordinate faster than the shocks sequentially sort of with the model. Because of the way that like you're solving models, so like the market clears, you have a shock and the market clears, and that's not necessarily the case, right? Because if you have inventories, and so if you have the shock somewhere in production, like it's not necessarily the case that immediately sort of people are able to readjust to have like aggregate supply and demand. And I forget, there was a like
It
one
leads to a smaller shock.
exactly, and so that's why you have this case with the inflation graphic where like it keeps going back to 2% relatively quickly, because the agents are just in the model are coordinating much better than perhaps is reasonable, whereas in our model it takes a long time for them, and sometimes then they over coordinate. So like you then have this like deflationary period and you oscillate a little bit before people are like, okay, wow, so sort of dampen down over time.
Thank you.
Alan?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks so much for the thesis, and also the heading in a direction which a number of us have tried to head in for a long time. And the older people here may remember that there was a thing called WEA, which still goes, in fact. And it's 27 years on now, I think, and attracts a reasonable number of people every year, but not many more each year. And that comes straight to the first question that you asked, which was how much complexity do we need? And I think that's where we go wrong straight away, because I would have said, no, the world is complex. It's not how much do we need. The world, how complex is it? That's a different story. But nevertheless, I don't think it sounds as if it's a sort of add-on. Just as econometrists will always put at the end an error term, which actually means this is our ignorance. This is what we don't know about. And so I think that to treat complexity by saying that, you somehow a little bit betray the people who don't think that we were on the right lines to start with. And I had a couple of quotes about that to illustrate the point. First of all, you may remember that as a gentleman who was known as Mankey, and couldn't be a more standard economist than that. And he said many years ago, in 2006, he said, look, the fact that modern macroeconomic research is not widely used in practical policy making, and that's still true, by the way, is prima facie evidence that it's of little use for this purpose. The research may have been successful as a matter of science, but it has not contributed significantly to macroeconomic engineering. And I think, I hope that we're sort of in the business of macroeconomic engineering, and to be treating this as a sort of independent realm in which people think about very sophisticated models of the economy is probably not the way you want to go if you want to understand how the economy works. And on that lines, I want to quote, make a second quote, but this is the problem with getting on. You remember these people. And this is a correspondence with Bob Solo. And you may remember that Bob Solo just died very recently and unfortunately didn't quite make it to 100. But I don't think he actually cared very much. But what he said in this letter to me was, my view of the way economists actually do behave coincides with yours, and more especially about macroeconomists. I've become a sort of common scold on this subject. I wholeheartedly agree with the point that economics self-destructs, in part because we insist on supposing that everywhere and always individuals maximize purely individualistic preferences, subject only to technological, legal, and budget constraints. It is a transparently false assumption, and the Brotherhood expends vast ingenuity trying to account for facts within that silly framework. There are at least two of us. So I was very proud to be one of the two. But anyway, but the point is, again, I think that if you like, people who sort of work in policy and so forth, they don't actually take theory seriously as an explanation of the economy. I think that, and you show that too, but we all have a tendency when you're building sort of agent-based models or so forth, to say, yeah, well, at this point, when I'm going to define the rules for the people or something, I take standard things. And many agent-based models are full of guys who are behaving like Bob Solo's economists. And I think that's an inappropriate assumption, and we don't need it. And I don't think we should do that, because you say, well, this makes me more respectable with respect to the profession. But that shouldn't be one's aim in life, to be respectable. Anyway, let's go into the questions specifically on your thesis. And first remark, simply very quickly, is that agent-based models, you attribute, like a lot of people, the first models really to the Santa Fe Institute, the sort of meetings there and so forth. But as somebody at the Bank of England, Turrell, pointed out, one of the first scientists to apply agent-based model techniques was Enrico Fermi, who was trying to solve problems involving the transport of neutrons through matter, and built essentially what we would now call agent-based models. So I think that's the sort of thing you could throw in when you go to a cocktail party. Enrico Fermi was there before, and so forth. Now, what about the economic theory that we put into these models? And the thing that didn't, I think, come out very clearly was, what sort of individual are you really trying to capture? And I think one has a tendency to try and impose the standard assumptions on our individuals. But should we do that? I think that Jean-Philippe knows perfectly well that you can get very complex phenomena from very simple agents and very simple interactions between them, like the game of life and so forth. So I'm not sure that we really want to impose on the individuals in our models the sort of axioms of rationality that we attributed in our models, and we should perhaps try and work with much simpler people. And I think it was, I had a quote here from Leon Hufeld. He said, economics seems to be, as far as he could make out, incredibly smart people in unbelievably simple situations, whilst the real world, in fact, is more accurately described as believably simple people coping with incredibly complex situations. And I think the complexity is in the world, not in the behavior of the individuals. as it were. Okay, so on those lines, you mentioned also rational expectations. You say, well, that always comes back in. But Tom Sargent, who got a Nobel Prize for working in that field, he said all agents inside the model, the econometrician and God, all share the same model. But he said that real people have limited horizons and limited capacity for attention. I think that's exactly right too, that we shouldn't somehow try and impose on our poor guy in the street that we're supposed to be modeling our axioms of what we think is rationality. Okay, so I won't even talk about Kehoe and company. Other techniques, it just struck me in passing when you would, in fact, I didn't think about it as I was reading the thesis, but there was a technique, I don't know if it's still being used by econometricians, called projection pursuit of regressions, and where essentially you have this huge space, very sparse data scattered around, and your problem is to try and make some sense of that. So what you do is start out in one direction, regressing on certain variables, and then those that seem to contribute, you keep, and those that seem not to contribute as you go through this space, you drop. And so gradually you reduce your number of parameters or variables that you're interested in by this procedure. And it seemed to me that this is somehow may be useful in the sort of world you're working in, because as you said, as you say in the thesis, you look at this space and it's very sparse, the base you're looking at it. It's a huge space, and you've got to somehow get through there and reduce that. And so I thought maybe useful for you to look at that. And then you'll have a few remarks about messaging. How should the authorities, as it were, communicate to people out there what's going on? And is it useful to do messaging? And I think we might take a remark from Alan Greenspan, who once said, if I turn out to be particularly clear, you've probably misunderstood what I meant. And I think but you may remember Alan Greenspan, but he was a very cryptic person. And what he said was, we really can't forecast all that well, and yet we pretend that we can, but we really can't. And the point is, do even the people who are trying to ask other people about their expectations, do they themselves have a good idea of what's going on? And I think if you're interested in that, you might look at some papers by Jeremy Rudd at the Fed, who basically says, let's not try and pull the wool over everybody's eyes. We really don't know much about how to forecast. And he was seriously criticized by other people, but they keep him at the Fed, which is a good thing. And yes, surveys of inflation expectations. So that's something you talked about. And the question is, how much does any individual, really an ordinary individual, know about what inflation is, even, let alone what he expects it to be in the future? And do they have a sort of precise idea? Because that depends very much on their own circumstances. The guy at the bottom of the heap doesn't really worry too much about changes in basic food prices, where the guy, the other way around, he does worry a little bit. And whereas the more wealthy person isn't really affected by that. So inflation is also a perception, and so inflation expectations. I think it was also Rudd who said you shouldn't bother about inflation expectations. And I think if we try and imagine that these people are thinking about the exact track that inflation is going to take, you get led way, way far away from what's actually going on. And people do tend, as was mentioned, to follow the herd on that. Now, my last two questions are really about, is the Phillips curve now, after all that you've said, is that dead in some sense? And I think that's a real question. And, all about current monetary authorities tend to think that there's still something in the Phillips curve. And the question is there really? And should that not appear much more in the models? Now, Jean-Philippe just took out the thesis there. He obviously going to find something which says that you were very worried about that.
I feel like with the Phillips curve, Francois is the expert on why the Phillips curve is what it is and why it's not very useful.
And I think, lastly, an agent-based model should be able to take into account, as you mentioned, the heterogeneous agents. But heterogeneity has many, many dimensions. And, for example, we talked about climate change at some point, and we have a horrid tendency to go on climate change indicators. So we go for an indicator like global warming. Okay, what's it? But the geographical dispersion of that and the consequences on the people in the different areas is very important. And if we leave that on the sides, telling people, well, you actually, as the I think European Commission recently said, we're heading for 4%. You know, 4% is a real disaster. And
4 degrees.
sorry,
4 degrees.
what did I say?
4%.
Thank you. 4 degrees, right? And 4 degrees would be a disaster. It would take us in the other direction, roughly back to the Quaternary Ice Age, if my memory is correct. And so I think that we should take account also of the fact that when you say you have a forecast that affects people, the forecast will be part of the distribution of the forecast. And we should be worried very much about where in that distribution we're going to go. So those are my comments, and thanks very much for heading out courageously in this direction. And I would have thought that some people would have by now become somewhat discouraged, but I'm glad to see that you're still hewing the right path. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, so a lot of comments. I definitely agree with the sort of simpler individual approach, in part because, like, I mean, like you said, like in my rational expectations framework, everyone knows the structure of the whole economy in a way that everyone knows is God, and that's just example, it's not possible in an ABM, right? Because you have this simulation over time, so nobody knows, or like, at least it would be too complicated for everyone to potentially know the true path, and so you do end up with having to use like a procedural rationality, like just a rule of thumb, say in but you're also correct that there was a recent paper, I think it was by the Sethna group, about how the degree to which you have the neoclassical assumptions in ABMs. And as far as most macroeconomic ABMs go, a lot of them do have this type of the framework, for instance, like with the causal pricing, which is like a partial adjustment, where it's only some firms can adjust in a given period. Like that is initially, it's a causal pricing rule in a DSG, but then you find similar types of rules in ABMs, which is part of why I think DSG people, while it might seem like it's a totally different world to study an ABM, it's actually not necessarily a totally different world. It's just a different solution to the model that they're trying. In the sense that DSG would be a very, 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 very specific niche of an ABM, where everyone knows the whole structure of the model and everything clears at all points. Yes, the projection pursuit, or I guess in a sense, it's kind of like throwing the kitchen sink and having all variables and then reduce and then rerun the regression to sequentially find. As far as the stiff and sloppy parameters go, I don't well, I mean, this is kind of what happens when you start perturbing the sloppy parameters, which initially start as parameter combinations, and then as you push this combination, basically you perturb into this without changing the overall phenomena. As you perturb further in this direction, you basically eventually this vector that might be a combination of say hundreds of parameters tends to resolve down to kind of like 2 or 3 parameters, where you can then take those parameters, go back to your equations and say only the ratio matters. At least that's the finding that has happened in the literature. And if we, I guess, for the physicists, you have like a manifold, and you basically go into the boundary of this manifold. It's kind of what happens where some of the parameters stop mattering as much. So that would be my main responses. Yeah, I was not familiar with Fermi being necessarily the first one with ABM, but I just think that the scientific people were perhaps the first ones to put like 6 characteristics onto like as far as complexity in economics. Yeah. I mean, Schelling was also an early person that did this like manually by hand, computing out the segregation. So yeah, I think that would be my main responses to your questions.
Thank you.
Thanks. So then I'll go ahead with my list of questions. My pen was dying, so I'll try to remember what I was supposed to say. Well, I have three types of questions. First, let me say that indeed it's very well written, and you have clearly setting the picture at the beginning of the thesis with a lengthy introduction, introducing all the concepts, so it's quite self-contained and it's very nice. And then also, on top of having a lot of material in the thesis, it's very well organized. So congratulations for that. And then to my question. So I have first a set of questions about the kind of more methodological nature. So as you said, stiffness or slopiness is a local property, so to say, right? So you touched a bit upon that on the thesis, but for some specific models. But okay, one question was to which extent you observe, I mean, would be the best case is, I presume, for theory generation of organic theoretical insight is when the stiff direction are stable throughout the parameter space, right? But that's because then you identify a theory almost to say that those are papers. But the question is, okay, to which extent this is the case? That's the first question. Then a kind of anecdotal or curiosity question is also, I mean, is there anything specific about stiffness, slopiness when you approach the corner of the boundaries of the parameter space? There's something specific at this stage, or does the method work still? Because in some of these models you would have, sometimes the most meaningful value is a corner value, right? So in this case, is the methodology of use. So then you have this algorithm to explore the parameter space by doing some kind of gradient descent in the way of
ascent, kind of like more an ascent of the gradient.
Yeah, an ascent, and that's a gradient descent, right? Now, could be the case that you could circle around this kind of algorithms. In particular, that's like to more general question, if let's say stiffness is not necessarily uniformly distributed over the parameter space, right? As a dual of direction, you might have points where you have larger eigenvalues typically. So you might have more steep points, I don't know what you would call it, but you can have points where you have more actions, so to say, taking place, and in a sense your algorithm could circle around these points. So and related to that, okay, so that's one point. Yes. Related to that, then there's the question of what have you identified as the direction in the set of models. This you touched upon a bit. The set, I mean, if there are commonalities, you look at different models, you look at TFG, you look at agent-based models. Do you gain some insights on what are stiff directions? And as you say, and of course, again, from the point of view of theory generation, it's better for you if stiff direction coincide with the kind of canonical basis of the model where you have one parameter is stiff. If you have a very uniform combination of different set of parameters, I guess it's less informative to a certain extent. But so question is, are those simple, those stiff direction, or are they generally complex? You say more or less legal, we can answer that, I think. But still, I see if I take what you already said, seems to me that you're saying, so you mentioned price adjustment, wage adjustment, you mentioned also this causal pricing. So this could hint at the following. So you could think, okay, so first, But you could think that, in a way, if you connect to more mainstream models, let's say, first, the things that at least there is a beginning of a dynamic theory of what people have been interested in is the dynamic of crises or dynamic of adjustment to equilibrium. And if I make the connection with Sethna, where there might be steep points where direction are stiffer, isn't it the case that in your setting, then it's the further away you are from equilibrium of the underlying model, if this can be given a meaning in this different model, the more stiff the directions are, and the kind of stiff directions then are the ones which relate to getting closer to equilibrium. I mean, that's speculative from my point, but maybe you have an idea of that. Okay, and I have a last set of questions, or last question, if you want, about the policy implication of the work in general, or you say, okay, this could be useful for policy making to identify in the model what are relevant still directions. Well, in a sense, might be much more, even more relevant to identify in actual data where are the stiff and slopey directions. So do you think it's possible to, let's say, do you have sufficient, because I mean, when this comes from chemistry, I guess, or from biophysics, you are doing that on observational data. Of course, you generate the experiment, but do you think you have sufficient data if you map the policy space, for example, like the economics makes to a certain extent, to identify, what are stiff policy direction, in a way? I think that's one question. And the other question related to the point I was making initially about the fact that at certain points of the model, you might have, in general, larger eigenvalue or stiffest direction. Can you also identify like that, maybe, points which are, more on proximity of crises, or, to put it in the language of phase transition, and or to phrase the question is it the case that you have larger eigenvalues when you approach a phase transition, for example? And I mean, this would be relevant as early warning indicator if you then take it from the policy point of view. If you say, okay, when I am in this macro configuration, and on top of that, I have a central banker that is stupid enough to do typically that kind of moves, that's very bad, right? So yeah, that would be another way to go to policy with this kind of methods.
Okay, so I'll go sort of in reverse order from the largest eigenvalues before I transition. So when we initially studied this, we just started with 2 dimensions, where there's basically this vertical transition line in the interest rate, and there's horizontal ones in bankruptcy threshold. And the first caveat is it depends on the type of phase transition. So you can't, unless you're using numerical derivatives, you can't, other than by accident, discover a first order transition where there's just a threshold. Like you can't necessarily discover those. You can, for automatic differentiation, basically we smooth the threshold ever so slightly, and so then you kind of get the parameters, and so you kind of make it like a second order transition. And for those, we find that I didn't study the magnitude of the eigenvalue itself, but you do find that the spectrum kind of separates somewhat. So you basically so you might imagine in the middle of the full employment phase, you have like you have some form of spectrum, and then the first eigenvalue kind of moves further away from the second one as you get closer to the transition. And so like initially we also thought that like you could do, for instance, like a probabilistic approach where you take the choice of the direction you go in would be like relative to the inverse eigenvalue. In that case, it always go in the first direction because it goes straight across the transition. So this is for like second order transitions where there's some degree of smoothness over the transition once you get there. So as far as like the locality and the consistency of the stiff parameters goes, I'm kind of like jumping based on what I think is closest connected to this. I mean, like part of what I found once we did the automatic differentiation, so it was relatively late in the thesis, I was able to run a lot more explorations than the points in the parameter space. And it does seem, at least for the Macroeconomic model, to be relatively consistent within a phase. So assuming that the overall dynamics are relatively the same, then you get relatively consistent first stiff directions. And so that, like you said, might suggest, like, for instance, either policy implications or potentially reduced form models if those are the only things that would drive the dynamics. But then it also, you have the case where you have phases. So for instance, in residual unemployment and endogenous oscillations, you do get very different types of endogenous oscillations and different types of like levels of residual unemployment. And so there's more sort of a diffusion of what the main components are. So you don't get quite as much consistency. You still get some consistency, but not quite as much. But I do think you potentially could do some form of like coarse graining of the model within a given phase, and then try to identify sort of the more critical parts, as opposed to like this truly like local admixture of parts of the end, perhaps. And I think this might also be one way where you use like this pruning by sloppy directions that will change the stiffest direction, maybe get rid of some of those admixtures. It is the case that when you, or at least when here, when I take because the sign of the eigenvectors in the terms give me plus and minus. If I here let it be random, then you do observe a lot of what I call flip-flopping. So you do kind of, you go to points in the parameter space that are not necessarily far away from random. They're not close, but you do kind of ping pong back between, say, like across the transition, which makes sense because I mean the stiffest direction in this way tends to be. It's not the case they necessarily go back to exactly the same spots. I've never observed the fact that one direction goes exactly backwards, but you do kind of go across. So like if you have a vertical transition, then you might like ping pong upwards, for instance. So in this case, that's why we introduced this stopping criterion and having Taylor's mean field error and picking the sign based on that. Because then once I introduce that, then a lot of this flip-flopping vanishes, because if you step over a transition, then within a phase you have some variation, then it's you get a better pairwise mean squared error if you keep going the phase when you exploit this one a lot, as opposed to flip-flopping, because that stops your the quality of your exploration. So you'd have to kind of introduce something like that to prevent the kind of flip-flopping or going around in circles. And there are different eigenvalue magnitudes depending on the phase. So for instance, with the endogenous crisis case, we get these oscillations. The magnitude of the eigenvalue is basically, it's exponential. And so because you have like a small frequency, and so in that case, that's partially the reason why I picked the fixed step size, because in principle, you could do exactly what you said. You could, instead of saying fixed step size, say a certain degree of change in the model, and then your step size would be proportional to the inverse of the square root of the I. This has difficulties when you do you get to some oscillating phase like that, because then that basically goes close to zero, and so you're just taking these tiny steps, and so that's why we picked, just because then at least, you know, even if they goes like exponential, you do take a large enough step. But this is partially due to the choice of the loss function. So like I said, if you take a probabilistic approach, you could potentially not get this kind of issue, because then like that would be a small change as well. So I think part of that, in terms of the different eigenvalue magnitudes and what they mean, that would be dependent on the loss function you pick. And we've worked primarily with the mean squared error, and like the probabilistic approaches have not been, I mean, they've been done with KL for some physics models, like the Ising model, but with, and I think maybe Jim knows more about this, but they have not been really done with these types of models, or in general, like just taking the model and estimating the distribution and then trying to find the directions. And so this is what we're working on sort of now, in a sense. But for that, then the different eigenvalue magnitudes might be a little more robust, and then you'd have more of an implication, as opposed to here, it really depends on whether you have an oscillation or not, and if you're tuning it. And so I consider primarily the spectrum more than the magnitude itself. Yes. So policy implications for data. I mean, if you take like a model and comparing it to data, and you have various policies within the model, then you could essentially restrict your the parameter you're trying to analyze with these different solidarities to just the policy variables, and say, okay, well, maybe I'm interested in, say, like the phi pi and the phi u of the Taylor rule, and maybe some degree of fiscal stimulus or unemployment subsidies or tax rates, like all of the things that the policymaker can control. You could restrict your estimation of these directions to just those, and take as a comparison point, as rather than what I was doing being a model consistent, you take as your comparison points the data versus the outcomes of the models, and you just look at them in those directions, and then you should be able, which is kind of what you do when you fit the model, and so then you should, assuming you have a decent fit, probably be able to say, okay, as far as the policy space goes, these will be like the combination of policies that have more effect than.
But
But when would you need a model to do that? And you could do it directly. My question was, could you do it directly on the data, basically, if you have sufficiently large, long time series and heterogeneity of macro situation in a way, and you take a cross section of countries, of course, which are different. But I mean, if you find some consistency
I'm
across,
not sure you could apply this necessarily to just data, because I mean, like the estimation of the certain subprogram just depends on sort of the change in parameters. I'd like it is zero, like a true zero, but even numerically. And I'm not sure how you would be able to do that if you had just data. Like I'm not sure like what sort of set of parameters I would be trying to get basically possession of with just the data.
I mean, if you have sufficiently large heterogeneity in sample, let's say, prevailing interest rate, prevailing growth condition, inflation, policy response, I mean, smaller set of parameters than what you actually have, but maybe you have historically been observing a sufficiently large set of configuration to be able to reproduce exactly the same type of analysis on, let's say, some projection of different time series on the policies parameter space of some kind.
I mean, I guess if you have a parameter space where there's some degree of continuity that you can include the derivatives, then
That's
in
my
theory,
idea.
I can do that. I'm not sure how to write it down, so I don't know right now, but for me, the way I've understood for the derivatives, it's like you're either taking data plus model or just model, and so I'm not sure how just data would function in a sense. I don't know, to be honest. I think that covers most of your questions.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. And then we should have the supervisor. Maybe I don't know.
Okay. So, as usual, I'll just say a few words. Let's first start by congratulating you. Very nice presentation today. So for the history of it, I met Karl a few years back at the OECD. He was freshly graduated from Oxford, and he was then an intern with the NIAC division of the OECD. New approaches to economic challenges with Alan and William Hines. And at one of the workshops that we had there, we started talking about the possibility of him joining the group for his PhD. And he was going to be the first economist to join the group, actually. We had physicists and applied mathematicians back then, so I warned him that there were some risks with that, but he was very determined. He said he was fed up with the way he was taught standard economics, and that he really wanted to learn some physics. So on his own, he managed to convince the OECD to fund his PhD at Polytechnique, and so we started roughly 3 years ago. And well, I think the most important thing I have to say about Karl is that he was really closer to a postdoc than a PhD student. Karl was extremely mature and independent since the very beginning, and very skilled in all these things that PhDs usually have to learn on the job. So doing a proper literature review, writing a paper, giving a good talk, and so on. In some way, Karl seemed already quite familiar with all this. I don't know how. But this allowed him to spend more time defining his project or projects with an S, which I have to say he also successfully conducted almost by himself. Honestly, I feel like I didn't do much and needed to do much. So it was a real pleasure to have Karl in the group for the past 3 or 4 years. Because apart from the science, he was really of great help in growing the group, and by communicating on our research. Karl was in charge of our group's website, and I have to tell you, over the past 3 years, many colleagues congratulated us on our website, so we owe that to you. Worth mentioning that while doing your own research, you supervised a number of interns, 2 of which, Max and Elia, are now doing their PhD in the group, and that is probably in part because they enjoyed working with you in the first place. So thanks for that. And well, then you got married, you became a dad, and somehow you managed to remain as productive as before, which I also found very impressive. And on a personal note, I think I always remember the week we spent in Trieste at Mandel workshop. The title was Quantitative Human Ecologies, whatever that meant, which well, drove very interesting discussions. And we were with a couple of real Italian foodies from the group, Michele and Elia, always taking us to the best restaurants. And then we had our day visits to Venice before a few long hours spent at the Venice Airport Lounge, again discussing this workshop, which, as you said, led to Elia's PhD today. So it's very nice. So again, as I said before, it was a real pleasure to have you around. And I think I speak for all of us in the group when I say that we will miss you. And I wish you all the best for your future endeavors, both personal and professional.
It's very difficult to be the last to speak. Everything it's before, and in particular by Michele. And I really wanted to start by saying that it was a wonderful surprise to have you in the group, because yeah, you brought something really new and useful, with very deep knowledge of everything you talked about. And this was, I think, very useful for every one of us. Of course, the PhD students, but even ourselves. Yeah, I think you're great. I mean, you can do everything really, and you're very independent. So I'm just repeating what Michele said. Maybe I want to recollect what happened for this stiff, sloppy model project, because that was, I think, a very good example of how it works. So I knew about this sloppy model by Sethna for a long time, and suddenly it struck me that we should do that. And I remember that we had that discussion, I think, by Teams, I guess.
I think by Teams, because I came to you on mic 0 and I was like, you made a phase diagram. Can you, is there like, does physics have an automatic way of doing this? Because I mean, it would be useful for other models.
Right.
To which all of the physicists in the paper that I asked were like, no, we don't know.
And so I suggested to you that this might be a useful way to proceed, and then you immediately got the idea and then started working on it, and that enthusiasm and also the possibility of transposing the kind of vague idea into something concrete is one of your strengths, I think. So it was really great to have you. And so I want to, of course, congratulate you on everything you've done in your presentation and so on. But I just want to come back for 1 second on the set of questions that were asked and so on. I think people have forgotten about the title of your thesis. I think the title of the thesis contains everything, and so we've been taking us away a little bit in the discussion from the main theme. And to me, this is, or maybe I'm rambling, but this is really, for me, the most important thing about models in general, ABMs or any model, because the economy is so complex that the only thing I think we can do for now is not prediction of actual numbers, and this ties with Alan's remarks, but at least if we can get something that's roughly right, that at least, as you showed, does not predict inflation to go down when it's going up, it's already something not so bad and has policy implications. So I think the idea that the first thing we should do is to discover what kind of scenarios a model can produce is a very important and ambitious task in complex systems. So it might not feel ambitious because you're losing all what science is supposed to do, that is predicting numbers and giving actual precise predictions about things. But I think it's beyond what we can actually do. So we should, rather than be in denial, just embrace it. And that's what I think you contributed to unearth during your thesis. Thank you.
Thank you.